So I have a simple agenda in my talk today. I want to challenge everything you think you might know about what an industrial revolution is. Historians conceive of industrialization as the process whereby muscle, water, and wind power were replaced by fossil fuels as the primary motive power of production. The result was the increased efficiency and scale of economies. And in this process, iron, steel, and finally plastics replaced wood as the primary building material. My research challenges whether the transition to an economy based on fossil fuels and the transition away from wood is a necessary characteristic of industrialization. I argue that wood was essential to the transition to industrialization in parts of America and remained essential as industrialization reached its climax. To explore these issues, I used the logging industry in the American Northeast, which for several reasons remained relatively technologically stagnant for more than a century from about 1850 to 1900, while remaining competitive in an increasingly globalized market. My analysis demonstrates the encompassing scope of industrial capitalism and characterizes it as a force that sustains seemingly anachronistic practices as long as they are profitable. So the area under consideration is the northern forests of the United States, which is the shaded area in the top right part of the map there. It's 26 million acre bioregion, about 80% forest cover, Laurentian Mixed forest cover. Very diverse forest types are found within the forest, including northern hardwoods, spruce fir forest, red white pine forest, aspen birch forest, elm, ash, red maple, and oak hickory. Here's a little closer view of the area. Because of the dense forest and a really harsh winter climate, European settlement didn't come until very late in the northern forest. It was a very difficult area to transform into farmland. But as European settlers began to try to make the forest into farms around the 1840s, they became very intimate with the forest and its potential. They found that it was actually more profitable to use the forest to make forest products than to farm in many cases. As the growing seasons were very short and it required a lot of labor to make the land arable. Settlers, because the area was so isolated, settlers learned to make dozens and dozens of products, tools out of forest material alone because it was very difficult to bring in manufactured goods. They could use small amounts of metal and then forest products like this stem form handle to create tools. So every tree in the northern forest had a value, and these settlers learned to make several different types of commodities. Top left you see shingles made primarily from cedar. Top right and bottom left, it's long lumber and pulpwood, typically made out of white pine and spruce, and then also the bark of hemlock trees were used for their tannin for leather making. There were dozens of other products that settlers learned to make, including clapboards, railroad ties, barrel stays, lathes, planks, posts, canoes, sleds, shoe pegs, spools, clothespins, toothpicks, boot jacks, shoe last blocks. The list goes on and on, even consumables like maple sugar, spruce gum, and cedar oil. And along with commodities, they did also make folk art. So this is a spruce gum book on the left, and the gum of the black spruce tree was put into what they call a book, but it's really just a box to give as gifts or to sell. And they could be very ornate. and they just kind of open from the top like that to put the gum inside. So by the turn of the 19th century, a lot of the profitable tracts of forests were very far away from settled areas. So the northern forest denizens needed to go deeper into the wilderness to gather commodities. But as they did this, they still used the same type of technology that their fathers and grandfathers had used. Up until the 1950s, in fact, depending on the size of the operation, logs were still chopped by axe or cut by crosscut, skidded by horse, and transported to mills via river. As they went into more isolated tracts, they would build temporary shelters out of material at hand, sometimes just bark or small poles. But if they needed to bring horse or other draft animals into the forest with them, they needed to increase the size of the shelter because they needed more men, different housing arrangements, and eventually they could create very elaborate facilities deep in the wilderness, kind of factories in the forest. But again, everything was made from materials they found in the forest. They could make the roofs out of shingles, even the hinges of doors. Everything was, up until the 1940s, constructed right from the ground up with materials in the forest. So after they build a temporary shelter in the woods, they would typically wait until winter to begin moving lumber because, as I mentioned, there was a lot of snow, and once it snowed, horses were able to carry more commodities. So in a deep enough snow, one horse could carry the load of 5. So after snow fell, typically, they would build what's called a roller, which is a device used to make the snow roads even better by compacting the snow. And again, these were made completely out of forest products. And once you had a lot of snow and a well-rolled road, you could transport very large loads. And so they were making the production process more efficient using only wood. How it worked was, if you had long lumber particularly, you'd store it in the forest until the snow began to melt, and then you could transport it out of the forest on the rivers. So they would build small piles of logs in the forest. But the problem with small piles is that they were inefficient. They'd get covered with snow and they'd have to be shoveled off. The horse would have to move to many different piles. So to solve this problem, some operators used a par-buckling system, which with the use of a gin pole and a pulley, they could use horsepower to lift the logs up very large piles. And when you had a very large pile like this, you only had to shovel it off once, and you could gravity feed the logs right on to a sled that would pull up to the pile. So they made the forest a more efficient warehouse for their products. Some operators thought that they could improve the production process even further by using ice as opposed to snow. So they created these, this is called a sprinkler box, and you would fill it in a waterway with up to 60 barrels of water, and then an improvised spigot device would spread water across the roads. During the nighttime, this would freeze, and you'd have up to 6 to 10 inches of ice that you could transport logs on. And again, this was made from products completely in the forest, found in the forest. Once you had your ice roads constructed, you had to plow them off every so often, so operators would make plows right in the forest to plow off their ice roads. And with a well-maintained ice road, you could haul tremendous loads of logs out of the forest with just using horsepower. So these large loads of logs were great unless you had to go down a hill, because that could be a lot of trouble for the horses. So they invented a system called snowboarding, which, using a stump placed that was at the top of the hill, you could wrap a rope around the stump, and with a simple lever device, and the rope would obviously be attached to the sled, you could ease the load down hills so they could descend grades up to 40 degrees, even with a large pile of logs. So eventually, the logs would make their way to the side of the river, and when the snow melt, they would be gravity fed right into the water. But to facilitate their transportation downriver to mills, loggers would build, again completely out of forest products, splash dams or retaining dams, which built up the potential energy of waterways to force the commodities down the river quicker. But on small tributaries, this worked really well to transport long logs or pulp. But once the logs made it out to open water, they needed to be guided more closely. So what these operators would do is connect softwood logs with pins and ropes to create what were called booms. And you could anchor the booms strategically on the waterways to make sure they didn't go down the wrong tributary. And you could also use them to separate logs. And essentially, they made wild rivers into efficient conduits for the transportation of commodities. And these structures look very impressive from a distance. But perhaps the most ingenious thing that these operators did was when the logs got to standing water. So at the mouth of the river, they would collect the logs in a circle of booms, these improvised flotation devices. And once it was connected, once all the logs were inside the boom, they would build this device called a headworks, which is a simple wooden raft with a capstan, which is like a spool that has rope around it. And they would anchor the headworks in the middle of the lake. And through the power of muscle alone, by turning around the capstan, they could pull these tremendous booms of logs across standing water. And these would be booms that have millions of board feet in them. And here's another picture of headworks, and again, this would be anchored with a tremendous ship anchor to the middle of a lake. Sometimes they were horsepower, but this seems to be rare. So in conclusion, these settlers in the northern forest used wood to supplement their farming, and in the process became very familiar with the forest products around them. And they used their knowledge of the forest to increase the speed and efficiency of production to reach industrial levels of efficiency and scale. And so if we think about industrialization like this, we realize that industrialization doesn't depend on fossil fuels, but it's simply a process whereby the scale and efficiency of production is increased in a way that is cost effective. So you can make production efficient without having these harmful externalities caused by the use of fossil fuels, such as global warming. And it's something to think about when we're really feeling the effects of global warming more and more. Thank you.